Hey, this is Jacob Evan. Thanks for tuning in. In this video, I wanted to go over some of my recent study regarding the mamzeir, regarding the commands at the beginning of Deuteronomy 23. My intention is not to say that such and such is how it is with this subject, because I am not sure. But my purpose in this is to show my study of this subject and to discuss some of the relevant points as I would see it. In this passage, it refers to a few different types of people who are not allowed to enter into the assembly, and it uses the name, it refers to the assembly of, it uses the name of Elohim. So this word assembly is kahal, and I'll talk about that shortly. And in these verses, I wanted to note that the wording here regarding entering into the congregation, it uses the Hebrew word bo, it uses a form of the word bo, and this is what we normally see with someone entering or someone coming toward somewhere or something along those lines. And what it says in these verses is that certain people shall not enter or shall not come into the assembly. And it seems that whenever I thought about this verse in the past, up till a point, the way that I saw it was that these are certain people who are excluded or otherwise removed from the congregation. And so with these first two verses in 2 and 3 with the Jewish numbering system, in these verses it refers to someone who has had some type of castration, it appears, performed on him, and then it refers to the mamzeir, and these are not entering. It doesn't say they are being removed, though. It doesn't say that such and such person is cut off from the assembly. And that's something that I recognized whenever I was thinking about this verse more recently, that even though it should have been obvious, even though I could have just read it and realized that, it took a little bit of thinking to move past the way that I had previously thought about it, which was not entirely based on the text. And so this led me to consider the nature of the congregation, or the kahal, as the word is used here. This is not the word that's used in every instance in typical translations. There is another word, but in this verse it uses the word kahal, and so that word is what I paid attention to when I was looking through the listings in the Torah and the way this word was used, and wondering, well, what constitutes the kahal? And I will note that the way it is phrased in this chapter in Deuteronomy 23 is slightly different from the way it is usually used in the narrative of the Exodus or in the commands that are in the preceding books. Numbers 16:3 and Numbers 20 verse 4 are the other examples where it uses the name of Elohim in reference to the kahal. In both of these, it's the instance of the people complaining, the first one being Korah. In the other examples, we see a different phrasing. In Exodus 12:6, it commands that all of the assembly of the congregation of Yisrael is supposed to slaughter the Passover. It says, Kol Kahal Adat Yisrael. And leading up to that, it says in verse 3, who is being spoken to and being commanded is all of the congregation of Yisrael. And for congregation in this case, it says Chadat Yisrael. And there are a number of instances elsewhere in the Torah, either in the narrative or in the commands, that seem to equate these words on some level. The word Edah and the word Kahal. But leading up to this, there is no explicit explanation of who constitutes the congregation or who constitutes the assembly. We see in Exodus 12:19 that it refers to congregation of Yisrael. It uses Chadat, and it says, in the sojourner and in the native of the land. So it seems to be including sojourners in this case in Exodus 12:19. In Exodus 12:48 may elaborate on this in some sense, because it describes the sojourner sojourning with you, and then he is doing the Passover, and he is becoming circumcised, every male that is to him, and then he shall approach to do it, and he shall be like the native of the land. Interestingly, though, at the beginning of the book of Numbers, it refers to numbering all of the congregation of the sons of Israel, and it refers to Chadat B'nai Yisrael. And clearly, as we look at this, it's referring to the people according to their families, to the house of their fathers, according to their blood lineage of being descended from each particular tribal forefather, as I would understand it from Numbers 1:18. Throughout the narrative of the Torah and throughout the commands of the Torah, it uses this word just to refer to the people who are being commanded in general. And it also, at times, to a lesser degree, uses kahal, as we see in Deuteronomy 23. And sometimes even these two words will be used together in one verse. But from what I can see, there is no other passage that refers in this way to entering into the assembly, entering into the kahal. And so one might wonder, well, what is this? Does this mean that whenever the people get together to observe, for example, the Passover, or observe something communally like some of the other festivals, is this referring to the assembly of the people who are getting together to do the thing? Or is it something else? One thing I noted as I was looking through the passages is that there are a number of times when there is no clear observance taking place, and yet there is the reference to the assembly, or ha-kahal. Such as in Numbers 17:12, it refers to Aaron running into the midst of them, or in Numbers 16:47, if you're using the other numbering system. And in Numbers 20, it refers to Moses and Aaron going from before the kahal. And Leviticus 16:17 refers to the Day of Atonement, Day of Covering over all of the sins of all of the kahal of Yisrael. These passages and these related considerations led me to wonder, are the Israelites themselves entering into the congregation at any point, or are they naturally a part of it based upon birth? And my presumption is that that must be the case, since there is no description of them ever entering into it. Now, one might wonder, could this have anything to do with entering into covenant? Could this have anything to do with the covenant? And while that may be worth considering in this regard, it's also worth noting that that framing of entering into covenant does not appear in the Hebrew text. It does not appear in the Hebrew text of the Torah, and instead it often refers to cutting covenant or causing the covenant to rise, or also rendered as establishing the covenant. Entering into covenant is not something which we see, at least in that framing. So it is very different from this wording in question, and likewise, the assembly, the kahal, is referred to before the Mosaic covenant. What might be considered the Mosaic covenant was made in Exodus 24. It appears in Exodus 12 with the Passover, and that was before it. Maybe this could be connected in some way to the Abrahamic covenant, but it is clear that the rules are not exactly the same. So that conclusion could influence one's reading of Deuteronomy 23, because it's referring to entering into the kahal, in which case, if a person is already in it, then they're not really entering into it, potentially. So that would lead me to believe that these people that are being prevented from entering into the congregation in Deuteronomy 23, they are not Israelites. And that would be clear with some of the later examples like the Ammonite and the Moabite and so forth. Clearly they are not. But that would also potentially be the case with the previous two examples, where it refers to the person that has some type of injury and the mamzeir. So let's look at these two verses in more detail, this chapter 23 verse 2 and chapter 23 verse 3, or in the other numbering system verses 1 and 2. So a literal translation of this might be one being wounded by crushing and one with the pipe being cut off shall not enter into the assembly of Yahuwah. And so you can guess what pipe is referring to. And with regard to the one being wounded by crushing, based on what I have seen in looking into the evidence for the word, it seems likely to me it's not talking about just some injury, that it's probably talking about some type of mutilation done for castration purposes. Now, it certainly does not say the reason for the command here, and so I'm not intending to interject the supposed reason and not intending to influence the reading based upon that supposed reason, but I'm just trying to read it in context and derive what the implication of the word itself might be. And as I was looking into this, there was a discussion that I had with some of my associates about whether this is referring to a person who had both of these things done to him, or whether it's referring to either or. And what I noted is in verse 4, also known as verse 3, that it refers to the Ammonite and the Moabite shall not enter. And it uses the same prefix, it uses the and equivalent, and it also uses the singular verb about he shall not enter in this verse, just like it does in the verse regarding being wounded and having the pipe cut off. And so it looks to me, just based upon the form of the later verse, that it probably is either or. So I assume this would be some kind of foreign eunuch or something along those lines that is being excluded, that is not allowed to enter into the assembly. Verse 3, or also known as verse 2, where it refers to the mamzeir, is a little trickier though. So before I get into what is the definition of the mamzeir, one thing I wanted to note about this verse is it has an additional part to it compared with the previous verse, because it says, even the 10th generation for him shall not enter into the assembly. So this is a distinction between the previous verse, because the previous verse doesn't refer to this. But there could be a few different reasons for that. One obvious reason being that if a person has been damaged in the way described in that previous verse, wounded by crushing or having the pipe cut off, he's probably not going to have a 10th generation to him, unless he had kids before that operation was done. It also could just be because the person that had that done to them, say that he had offspring prior to that operation, the people that are descended from him are not necessarily affected by what happened to their forefather. So that may be another reason why it would be different from, say, the example with the Ammonites and the Moabites, because they would still be Ammonites and Moabites in the subsequent generations of them, at least as we would consider the male line. Also, on the other hand, one could look to this and see that maybe this is evidence that the mamzeir is, maybe it's a nation. And this was one view that I heard a long time ago from some Karaite groups, that maybe mamzeir is referring to a nation of people because it seems similar in the way that it's worded to what goes on afterward in the commands. It refers to these other nations. And also one might look at the only other time this word is used in the Tanakh in Zechariah 9:6 and see that it's talking about all these different various nations and these various places, and that a mamzeir is dwelling in Ashdod. However, I would take issue with that because mamzeir does not appear to be a word referring to a person from a nation. And the reason that I say that is because it does not have the suffix that we would expect. It does not have the E at the end or the yod at the end, which is normally in English, it would be like having the ite at the end. So Ammonite, Moabite. In Hebrew, it shows up as Hamoni and Moavi, Mitzri, etc. So it's not mamzeir or mamzeiri, it's just mamzeir. And so I don't see that as likely that it would be some nation. It's just not spelled in the right way, at least as I would understand it. At least so far as it referring to the name of a nation. Plus, as far as I know, there's no evidence to suggest that there was a nation named that either. So in the process of delving into this word, I began to recognize very clearly that this is a pretty tricky word. This is a pretty obscure word. And there are a number of ideas about what it might mean. There are a number of traditions about it, but not all these traditions are in line with each other, and they're not really backed up by much, as far as I can tell. One popular view is that it's referring to a person who is born of illegitimate birth or an illegitimate union, And how specifically that is defined is different depending on which tradition you're looking at or which historic person is talking about the issue. And that might include the child of an impermissible mother, or a child from adultery or incest, or from some other illegal union, or someone who is descended from one who was sentenced to death, so the person shouldn't have been able to have kids, but he was sentenced to death, and somehow he managed to do that anyway. So with the child of the impermissible mother, the mother or maybe the father being the descendant of these nations that are supposed to be destroyed, the Canaanite nations, etc., that if that were the case, maybe that is what defines the mamzeir, that it's someone that's part Israelite and then also descended from these forbidden nations. So there are a few different views on that, and the Septuagint and the Vulgate translated as of a prostitute or born of a prostitute. But the thing which concerns me about it is that there doesn't seem to be a lot backing that up from the language itself or from the cognate languages and the possible etymologies of it. There doesn't seem to be much else backing that up other than just these traditions. And I know that from the Septuagint and the Vulgate that sometimes these translations are just way off, even if some of it is fairly on point and fairly literal. This is evident, for example, with the unclean birds list, at least with a few of the examples that show up there. The fact that some Jewish traditions would support this rendering does give it a little more credibility in my view, but it's still not the kind of evidence that I would like, and it's not really much evidence at all other than, well, someone thought it was this way at some point. And that is not the only view on the issue, and some include that it's an estranged one, or it's one who is a blemished alien, and as to what exactly that means may be unclear, and then one of unknown heritage, a drifter. In my research into the Semitic languages, I came across a few different possible connected words. One was to be rotten, and another was to denounce or withhold or to detour or circle or linger, and then also to be dirty. I mentioned earlier the one rabbinic opinion that was blemished alien, and this appears to be derived from two Hebrew words being formed into a compound word, and maybe that is the case, I don't know. So there was the blemished alien possibility, and I noted from Ethiopic to commit adultery, to stretch out, unjust, and unmannerly. I would be a little bit hesitant because there is a possibility that it is a bit later, although maybe not. The other issue is that one of the consonants is different. The second mem would be a noon, actually. There is a possibility that it is relevant, though. There is a possibility that it is connected. There are examples of words which are connected, and that type of change in sound is possible. And so maybe you could look at that and say, well, things seem to be lining up in that traditional direction, in the direction of from some type of illegal union or from adultery or incest or something along those lines. Or you might look at these other Semitic words and think, okay, maybe the to be rotten and to be dirty, maybe that's related to the to denounce. So maybe it's something like the bad one, the rejected one, something like that. And that's a bit of a stretch, potentially. It's just another possibility. And in going into some of the practical considerations and some of the thoughts regarding other commands that I had related to how we're defining mamzeir or what the possible definition of it is. One thing I considered is that in some of these situations of adultery, the father may not be known. It may just be presumed that it's the person whom the adultery was committed against. And on a practical level, is that person going to be known to be able to be excluded? Now, that may not be proof of anything in particular, because there are other things which may not be known or may not be readily known. For example, a person may think that they are of one descent and be of another nation's descent, and may end up getting into the congregation by accident, even though they shouldn't have been. And while the practical concerns may be helpful in some cases, I don't want to assume too much. I don't want to interpret words based upon how I think the command should be observed, or whether I think it's practical to observe. And then there might also be the question that if the person is descended from an Israelite anyway, then would that person not already be in the congregation? And so if we were interpreting it as they're already in it because of their blood, and it doesn't talk about removing them, cutting them off, then that is also going to influence which of these possibilities we think is appropriate or likely. And there is another consideration that I had that came to mind with regard to this verse. So in the commands, we have forbidden nations, the nations that are commanded to be evicted from the land, and they're not supposed to intermarry with the people, according to Exodus 34:16. And there's also the command regarding the destruction of Amalek, such as in Deuteronomy 25:19. And one thing I considered about that is we already have these commands which either implicitly forbid marriage with a certain group or otherwise exclude them, shall we say. We know of these other nations, and yet they are not mentioned in this passage. So it's not a requirement that they had to be mentioned in this passage, but if we took some view of mamzeir referring to the blemished foreigner, or if we took some view of it being the rejected or hated or bad ones, then maybe it's a possibility that could be referring to such an individual from one of those groups, or one who is descended from one of those groups. Maybe that is a possibility. So this is essentially what I arrived at with regard to mamzeir, and what I arrived at is that I am not sure what it is. I haven't seen what I would consider solid evidence. Now, I have been criticized before for having too high of a standard for what I consider evidence, and that has been seen as just impractical, and maybe that is the case, I'm not sure. I certainly don't want to say this is conclusively what it is without having a good reason for it. But those are the possibilities that I noticed as I was looking into this, and those are the possibilities that I considered regarding what it might mean and regarding what this verse means and the surrounding verses. Hopefully in the future that will become more clear, and hopefully in the future more evidence for the language will continue to be found. Thanks for watching. Guard the commands, stay focused, and be tenacious.